Okay, so my media representation topic is on women of the Global South. So, what is Global South? First of all, I would like to start by providing three definitions. The first definition: Global South refers to economically disadvantaged nation states as post-Cold War alternative for Third World. It refers broadly to regions of Latin America, Asia, Africa, and Oceania, also called periphery to denote regions outside Europe and North America, mostly low income and often politically and culturally marginalized. The second definition: Global South addresses spaces and peoples negatively impacted by contemporary capitalist globalization. It accounts for subjugated peoples within the borders of wealthier countries. And the third definition: Global South, as it refers to the resistant imaginary of a transnational political subject that results from a shared experience of subjugation under contemporary global capitalism. Well, as can be seen through the evolution of the concept of the term Global South, there has been a shift almost from focusing broadly on geographic regions to beginning to zoom in and start to focus on individuals as well, thus highlighting an ideology. So, the term Global South marks a shift from a central focus on development or cultural difference toward emphasis on geopolitical relations of power. It functions as more than a metaphor for underdevelopment. It references an entire history of colonialism, neo imperialism, and differential economic and social change through which large inequalities in living standards, life expectancy, and access to resources are maintained. So, who are the women of the Global South? So they are women living in the periphery who are negatively impacted by contemporary capitalist globalization and who face large inequalities in living standards, life expectancies, and access to resources. So is it safe to say that there are women of the Global South living in the Global North? I think it's safe to say yes. So how are women of the Global South represented in the media? So first of all, the term Global South yields approximately the same search results as the term Third World. Both terms are more commonly depicted through images of women of color living in Third World countries. On the other hand, women of color and white women of the Global South living in the Global North are not only underrepresented in the media, they are also often stigmatized. So let's take the welfare queen, for example. Okay, so there's huge stigma surrounding this term, which often tends to, first of all, criminalize women, as a result of fraudulent behaviors that have been done by some individuals. Okay, and it also portrays women as uneducated and even perhaps lazy. Um, Not to mention that a misconception of, the idea of receiving welfare is that it is given mostly to people of color. And I actually found a post on Instagram that says something interesting about this, and it reads: Owsley County, Kentucky has one of the highest rates of food stamp enrollment in America. It is 98.7% white and overwhelmingly Republican. Remember this when you hear someone on the right wing say that food stamps are only for liberals and welfare queens in the big city. So, as we can see here in these representations, it really, targets a particular group, especially people of color, right? Women of color. And it really ignores systemic and political oppression and discrimination. Right? So, at the most basic level, what we can see from these representations is that even though the term Global South marks a shift of focus from cultural difference towards emphasis on geopolitical relations of power, its meaning and representations aren't exactly congruent with one another. So, if we were to focus on, political and systemic oppression, where would that lead us? Right? So one way that we can begin to, think about the political and systemic challenges that women face is through feminist and women's movements, from women from both of the global south and the global north. And I think it's important for us to consider for a brief moment here the concept of neoliberalism, right? So, neoliberalism transfers control over economic resources from the public to the private sector. This has severe implications for women that include, not surprisingly, issues with employment and financial stability. The effects of neoliberalism also spill over to feminist and women's movements, organizations that are dependent on funding from the state or government. And when we add globalization to the equation, the implications of neoliberalism transcend national boundaries to impact not just the employment and distribution of resources, but also women's movements organizations that seek international and transnational funding and support. And one of the challenges that women face as a result of this is that, sometimes their autonomy is really restricted as they are unable to carry out their agendas, and they are instead forced to comply with the organizations that are providing the fundings, to comply with their agendas, right? So these are some of the structural or systemic challenges that women face. But there are also, basic daily life challenges that are cultural and social in nature. And some of these challenges are sought to be overcome through women's mobilization for gender equality, equal pay, women's rights for protection, education, and land ownership, reproductive rights, and increased representations in the political sphere, as well as public and private economic sectors, to name just a few, right? So the challenges, there are a lot of challenges, right? So some of these challenges result from the intersectionality of systemic cultural, social, and political factors that can be traced from not only neoliberalism and globalization, but also patriarchy. And, you know, as deep and, strong these challenges may be, women have been very resilient in, responding with strategies that can begin to tackle these issues. And some of these strategies include forming transnational networks and coalitions. So, attempts at addressing intersectionality of oppression and discrimination have also been made as women's movement groups form alliances with other religious groups and LGBT activists for combating gender inequality, racism, and indigenous rights. Women have also learned to negotiate the local, national, and transnational arenas. This entails attaining strong foundations with the national context while forging productive links with transnational forces. So this is all great, right? But when I was reading all of this stuff, I came across, something, and to me, that really shows the insidious nature of systemic oppression, and that is the issue of class. As even in feminist and women's movements, there are efforts that only end up serving women of the middle class, or white women of the middle class, right? And so when we ask the question of who this is serving, I think the answer is pretty clear, right? Who is it serving? I have three videos here that provides three perspectives of women of three different countries of the world about, women living in developing countries. So I'll leave that for you guys if you would like to watch. And I have a couple of questions for closing here. And the first question is, what do you think are the implications of the underrepresentation of Global South women living in the Global North? The second question, what are some implicit messages that are being sent through the current representations of women of the Global South? And the third question, what do you perceive is the difference between empowering women and supporting women? All right, so that is all I have for today. I look forward to having more discussions about this in class.